There's an evil in this world. It's an evil that's so dark, it rarely gets brought into the light. Because it's not brought into the light, it continues to grow and to spread like the worst pandemic we've ever seen. This episode comes with a very serious trigger warning. In telling the story of John Glen Murdaugh, you'll hear excerpts from the book Swamp Kings by Jason Ryan, where he conducted interviews with Johnny Murdaugh's stepdaughter, Cheryl McKnight. It will deal with the topics of domestic violence of adults and children and child sex abuse. If you find that this topic is too triggering for you, please stop watching now. At the very least, don't watch alone. And if you are suffering trauma from this particular situation, you are not alone and there is help available. I'm Cassidy O'Connell, and this is Murdaugh Mafia, Rise and Fall, the monster in metals. Welcome. For a few years, I had the pleasure of assisting a breast cancer seminar that was held in Paris every year. Physicians would come from all around the globe bringing statistics, speeches, and slides to share. Most of these were very hopeful, introducing new methods, new medicines, new screening. It gave hope. I can no longer recall the statistics I heard. I don't remember which type of imaging was better for which type of cancer. I don't remember the names of the new medicines that were introduced or how effective they were. But I will never forget the first time a doctor came to represent South Africa. She opened our eyes to how old cultural beliefs and superstitions have brought havoc and unnecessary suffering and death to the women in her country. These women often feel embarrassed, ashamed, and are made to feel so if something is wrong with their breasts. Throw in the superstition, and they'll feel that they have done something wrong that has brought evil spirits into their home. These women can be cast aside for their afflictions. So because of this, they often didn't come to seek help until it was far too late. I'll never forget the slides of women whose cancer had grown from their breast through their skin and opened them up. Often these wounds were filled with maggots. In many of those cases, had they come forward when symptoms were early, the lives could have been saved. But it's the shame and the misplaced blame that kept them quiet and cost them suffering and death. This is what has happened in the case of child sex abuse. The victims are ashamed. Though the shame is not theirs to bear, they carry it. People may place blame, point fingers, so these victims often go through their whole lives carrying this burden. Cheryl McKnight was Johnny Glen Murdaugh's stepdaughter. She carried her secret for her whole life, until recently when she told her story to Jason Ryan, author of Swamp Kings. I applaud her bravery, and I hope it brings her some peace. Many adults around this family were frightened into silence, so just imagine what it was like to be a child faced with this. There was no one to help her, not even her mother. And as Johnny bragged about what he was doing to his friends and his family, rather than feel sorry for her, they thought they might get into the action as well. It's a difficult topic to speak on. Here was a man from one of the most powerful families in the area, a man decorated multiple times over, a war hero. Who was gonna listen to this poor little girl? Mrs. McKnight, we're listening now. As mentioned in episode 1 of this series, John Glen Murdaugh was Buster's younger brother whose birth was quite traumatic for their mother Etta and caused, or at least contributed to, her death 3 weeks later. John, known as Johnny, would tell his stepchildren how his father, Randolph Sr., held that against him and treated him coldly. Another treasure from this book, Swamp Kings, that I just can't put down. I have taken it everywhere, as seen here in Amsterdam. My copy is now full of sticky notes and scribbles and highlights, and perhaps a few tears. It is by far the most informative book I've read on the Murdaughs so far, and I have read my share. There are details in this book that I can't share on YouTube because of terms of service, and I think the words would actually stick in my throat were I to try. So please, if you're going to read a book on the subject of the Murdaughs or the Low Country, make it this one. This book has so much exclusive information in the form of interviews. Even as a child, Johnny had a compulsion to harm, killing small animals such as chickens just for his own amusement. It's interesting to note that this was also something that Paul Murdaugh would do decades later. In addition to his traumatic birth, Johnny suffered multiple blows to the head, starting with an automobile crash when he was 12 years old, where he was thrown from the car, damaging his skull. He was later sent to military school in Georgia, some distance from his family. He suffered a war injury during World War II and reportedly once dove into a pool from the roof of a pavilion next to it. The problem was he dove into the 2-foot section, cracking his face and peeling the skin from his nose. He became a boxer after the war, in addition to being a farmer. As a boxer, he endured many blows to the head and was left with a broken nose that turned to the side. Now, when I describe the hardships he endured, mind you, I'm in no way excusing how he turned out. We are masters of our own life paths. More people than we can count have had worse childhood trauma and not turned out the way Johnny did. Their own pain being the motivating force for not wanting to bring pain to others. In everything I'd read about Johnny before I read Swamp Kings, his many medals and honors from World War II are what's mentioned. In newspaper searches, I came across his boxing matches and not much else. But in real life, Johnny was the town drunk that people were afraid of. Fathers warned their daughters to stay away from him, and with good reason. Johnny's been described as being built like Buster, but beefier, others comparing him to Popeye. He married a woman named Verlie DeLoach in 1953. Verlie was a beautician with 3 small, beautiful children. They lived on the Almeda property purchased by Josiah Murdaugh years before, and where the late Randolph III and his wife Libby's home is located to this day, and where many of us believe Alex stashed the murder weapons until he could come back, collect them, and dispose of them in a more permanent resting place. Johnny farmed the land and did other, shall we say, odd jobs for Buster. A sign outside the home said, "Don't worry about the dog, beware the owner." The locals verified that Johnny was indeed a man to fear. Most people interviewed were not willing to go on the record, still afraid to speak out against a Murdaugh, but they did have the following things to say about Johnny. He was always drunk, always crazy, had a few marbles loose, had a screw loose. They say he lost his driver's license for driving drunk, so he drove a tractor around town, much like the old George Jones song. He would drive long distances, often shirtless, weaving all across the road, and was said to have, in a fit of rage, parked across the door of Buster's law firm and walked away with the key, blocking the door till he got what he wanted, which is believed to have been money. Cheryl remembers when she was a child, Buster would come over and speak to Johnny, just out of earshot by the farm truck. It seemed to her Buster was calling the shots and Johnny performed the dirty work. After Buster was gone, Johnny would complain about Buster owing him, saying nobody loved him, that he'd been mistreated his whole life, and that his father had told him that he wasn't born right. One Hampton County woman noted that maybe he'd have felt better if he'd have realized this was the way Buster treated everyone, because, quote, Mr. Buster was all about Mr. Buster, unquote. He was known to frequent the Varnville pool in the summer, where one girl had been specifically told by her father, who was a friend of Buster's, by the way, that she was not allowed to speak to Mr. Johnny, or, specifically, to allow him to flip her into the pool, and that if she did, she would be forbidden from going back to the pool again. This tells me that people were aware of what he was doing. Another man says Johnny was always trying to bring girls home from the pool, and once he himself had been invited into Johnny's home after being given a ride home. He says the walls were covered with nude pictures, and that Johnny slipped into another room and came back out with a pile of panties he claimed to be from his many conquests, saying that all the pretty girls at the pool loved to have sex. He didn't say it quite that nicely, but I don't speak that way. The man thought it more likely that he'd swipe them from the changing room at the pool, as he didn't believe these girls would get in bed with Johnny. I'm hoping it was as innocent as that. But the worst victim of all was his stepdaughter Cheryl. Her sister had stayed with relatives, but Cheryl and her little brother were brought into Johnny's home when their mother married him. He often wore his soldier's uniform, and when he wasn't, he was simply walking around the house naked. He was cruel and abusive, using horrifying methods of punishment, such as cutting off the electricity, putting hot peppers into their food, putting snakes and lizards into Cheryl's bed. I want to remind you again, there's a trigger warning on this video. Please take care of your mental and emotional health, and if you need to stop now, please stop now. When he would punish them, he would make them strip naked and would often keep their underwear after beating them, telling them that they didn't deserve underwear. He would scream at them till they wet themselves in fear. Once, when her little brother Franklin wet himself, Johnny made him wear a dress and walk to town. Their mother wasn't spared either. He would beat her, one time knocking her teeth out with the cooking pot. He even drugged her. It didn't do any good to call the police. Even if he was arrested due to Buster, he was released and back home before they could pack their things and leave. Sometimes Johnny would round them up at night, drive them to a cornfield, and tell them to run while he fired shots at them in the darkness. The kids found small nooks and crannies in their home where they would often hide from him. The home had previously belonged to a Dr. Tootin, and one of the closets was believed to have been used as a morgue when he owned the home. This would frighten most kids from going into it, but no fear of ghosts could compete with their fear of Johnny Murdaugh. The biggest nightmare for Cheryl was that Johnny had begun molesting her from the age of 4. When she was old enough to tell her mother what was happening, he beat her mother and then beat her. She never tried to tell again. The assaults became worse and worse, turning to every form of rape. Again, I won't go into those details here today, partly because of YouTube, and mostly because I'm struggling just to get these words out. She once came close to getting help when she and her mother were being treated at the hospital for the same vaginal infection. The doctors and nurses became suspicious and took Cheryl into a room away from Johnny. But Johnny called Buster, and the inquiry was stopped immediately. Johnny took his anger out on everyone and everything around him, beating even Buster's hunting dogs, and during one particular killing spree, killed 2 of Cheryl's dogs, the kittens that her cat had just birthed, and then made her watch as he hammered the skulls of both the mother and another cat. He would often tell her, as he took her mother somewhere, that he was coming back alone, and she'd never see her mother again. A very traumatized Cheryl would wait crying at the window, hoping beyond hope for her mother's return. She had every reason to believe that one of the times her mother wouldn't return. Johnny carried a .45 and often claimed to have killed people. Specifically, he told her that he had placed 5 bodies in the pecan grove at Almeda Farm, using a tiller to cut them up and plow them into the soil, saying no one would ever find them or know. She recalls a black farmhand named George, who Johnny particularly hated. His hatred grew after Buster asked George to pick up the slack at the farm since Johnny wasn't fulfilling his jobs. The responsibilities came with George assuming a truck that Johnny had previously used. Much like the threats against her mother, one day before leaving with George, Johnny told the family that if they wanted to see George, they better come now, because he wouldn't be returning home with them. George, in fact, did not return with Johnny, nor was he ever seen again. Cheryl still believes he's in that pecan field. Why Buster never questioned his employee's disappearance remains a mystery. It's my hope that with these stories coming to light, that pecan field might be investigated. Cheryl began to notice friends of Johnny's looks towards her as she grew older. Some of them began to speak differently to her, to touch her and treat her like a pet. She believes that Johnny had probably told them how he was using her, and instead of being disgusted and helping her, they were considering having a try themselves. But only one person ever actually did it. She was 8 years old when Johnny's nephew, Buster's then 17-year-old son, Randolph III, Alex's father, came to see her one day. Randolph had been close to Johnny back then. By this time, he was already dating his high school sweetheart and later wife, Elizabeth. He paid Cheryl a nickel to wash his tires, then invited her next door to his house to see the playground that Buster had built for his little sister Brenda. This sad little girl was so thrilled to receive such kind attention, but her thrill was soon dashed when Randolph III led her into the woods, where he, too, molested her. A short time later, he called her into his home and into an upstairs room with his little sister playing nearby. He opened his pants and had this 8-year-old child pleasure him. For me, his expecting this from such a young girl, for him to think that an 8-year-old would even understand this, tells me that he was well aware of what was happening to her by his Uncle Johnny. When she was a little older, Cheryl and her brother attempted to poison Johnny, slipping roach poison into his drink. Johnny became violently ill, and Randolph III was the one who came to nurse him through his pain and vomiting. Later, as an adult, Cheryl admitted to the poisoning, and Randolph III simply answered with, "I figured it was either your mom did it or something happened," which again seems to prove an awareness that they had reason to do such a thing. In time, Randolph III had grown weary of his Uncle Johnny, just as Buster had. He received a call at the law firm one day from a woman who had come upon a passed-out drunk Johnny lying on the side of the road, with his body half in the road and half in a fire ant hill, with the ants waging war with the skin that was simultaneously being scorched by the sun. Randy's response was one of annoyance, calling to mind Paul and Maggie's tones when Gloria Satterfield had fallen on their steps. Randy said thanks for calling, without even asking where his uncle had been found. She became a little more urgent, explaining that his body was in the road, to which Randy, annoyed, replied, "I'm coming." Cheryl managed to get away from Almeda and Johnny at the age of 16 when she ran away to live with friends, coming back as an adult to collect some old family dishware that had been left there. Johnny had moved from the old wooden house to a new brick home on the property. To her surprise, the doors and windows were all locked up, nailed from the inside. She climbed up to the roof and found an upstairs window that wasn't nailed shut. She climbed through, went downstairs, to find a giant moonshine operation. She returned a couple weeks later for more family belongings, and the equipment was all gone. The home was demolished a short time later. All trace of what had happened in that home gone, except for the memories that haunt her still. Her mother, Verlee, finally escaped her marriage to Johnny. She married Grover Wilson Hadwin Jr., whom we hope treated her better, but sadly was killed in an automobile accident in Valdosta, Georgia, on June 18, 1972, at the age of only 49. Johnny remarried a woman named Marilyn Russell that was 18 years his junior, and the mother of 3 daughters, whom I hope were grown by the time he became their stepfather. She passed away March 23, 1984, at the age of only 47, from what's described as a short illness. She shares a gravesite with Johnny. Cheryl had always wondered whether Buster knew about the things his brother Johnny had done, and shortly before Buster's death, she got her answer. In the late 1990s, Cheryl was working as a clerk at the magistrate's office after retiring as a judge. Buster showed up to see her. By that time, he was using a walker to get around, a walker with a spittoon attached so he could still spit his nasty brown juice wherever he went. He began, "I came to tell you something before I die. I want to apologize for what Johnny Glen did to you all." Probably a million feelings rushed through her entire body at those words, but without listening to anything she might have to say, Buster scooted off with the words, "Couldn't do anything about it then, and can't do anything about it now." Which may be one of the most maddening lies Buster ever told, for he had been solicitor. The solicitor who had sent 19 men to the death chamber, who carried a pocket knife formerly owned by a rapist, saying it was to remind him of his personal responsibility for every criminal in the 14th Judicial Circuit. That is, every criminal except those with the last name Murdaugh. Episode 4 is coming soon. This is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.